Okie doke, kia ora. So thank you to Quentin for coming along. We'll start with a karakia. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kina kina ki uta, kia mā taratara ki tai, e hi aka ane te akakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, tihe Māori ora.
Māori ora.
Warm welcome to everybody who's made it on time, and kind of a welcome ahead of time to the people who will join us soon, and particularly to Quentin for taking the time out tonight to talk to us. So I think the easiest thing, Quentin, is if I hand the floor over to you, and you can take it from there. You'll be able to share the screen.
Yep.
So it's all yours.
Okay, great. Well, thanks all for having me along. I'll get started. I'm going to try and make this work. Let's see. If I do this, then I can show you guys a screen and see some notes, which is handy. Can you see a slide?
Yep. It's looking perfect. Yeah, it's looking right up there. Looking great.
Okay, cool. Well, yeah, thanks for having me along. This is what I'm going to talk about. This question, are we evolved to tackle climate change? It's kind of a provocation for you guys. I hope you find it interesting. It's an idea and it'll be fun to talk about it at the end. Yeah, this is a longer talk. Dermot said that actually you guys like to have a chat about stuff as part of the session, so I'll try and charge through it and have time for a talk. Had I known, I might have prepared a slightly shorter one, but anyway, there'll be time to chat at the end. So I wanted to start with this picture of James Hansen testifying before US Congress in 1988. It was 30 years ago. He's a NASA scientist, and he's talking about the risk of anthropogenic climate change due to burning fossil fuels. And people listen to him. Here's the front page of the New York Times the following day. The headline, "Global warming has begun, expert tells Senate. Sharp cut in burning of fossil fuels is urged to battle shift in climate." And there's this graph of the increasing temperature and linked to fossil fuels. And since then, the Earth's temperatures continued to rise. The UN's IPCC has chronicled the accumulating evidence about the severity of the problem with successive assessment reports. We're now up to the 6th report in 2022. And also movie stars like Leonardo DiCaprio and ex-presidential candidates have championed the cause. We've formed global movements to promote climate action like 350 Aotearoa, Extinction Rebellion. But despite all this, the way most of us live, including some of our most polluting activities, has barely changed. And last year, 2022, CO2 emissions were as high as they've ever been. They dipped a bit for COVID, but they're back up and now they're record highs. And so James Hansen, the same climate scientist who made front page news in 1988, isn't happy. He was arrested 30 years later outside the White House for protesting the Keystone XL pipeline. He said, "We're failing miserably to address the climate crisis." And so what I'm talking about today is partly trying to answer the question, why are we failing? Well, if you believe some headlines, our brains just aren't wired for tackling problems like climate change. Take this headline, I think from the LA Times, "Why the wiring of our brains makes it hard to stop climate change." Here's another one from NPR in the States, "Why our brains weren't made to deal with climate change." Here's a header from The Guardian, a beautiful picture of a human brain saying, "Your brain on climate change, why the threat produces apathy, not action." And my favorite in the New York Times, "We're all climate change idiots." It's also not just newspaper headlines. These are claims being made by academics too. Here's a quote by Mark van Vugt and colleagues in 2014, our minds are not designed to respond to environmental problems when such problems are distant, global, and presented in abstract terms. In a way, it's unfair to expect people, Homo sapiens, to do this kind of monitoring, to do this kind of decision-making, because we're not wired for that, says Elke Weber from Columbia University. And the director of the Yale project on climate change communication says you almost couldn't design a problem that is a worse fit for our underlying psychology. Underlying all this is a body of work in psychology that seeks to identify psychological barriers to climate change. Oops, gone the wrong way. And so what I want to do here is pose this question: are we evolved to tackle climate change? And I've organized the talk in two parts. First, I'm going to talk about or introduce some of the psychological barriers that are proposed to make it difficult for us to stop climate change. But then in part two, I'm going to take a critical look at claims that we're hardwired to be bad at tackling climate change and argue that this idea isn't just wrong, but may itself be a barrier to action. Okay, so to begin, what are these psychological barriers to tackling climate change? I've already quoted this article, Mark Van Vugt and colleagues. They list a few here. We value personal over collective outcomes, prefer immediate over delayed rewards, value relative over absolute status, copy the behaviors of others, ignore problems that we cannot see or feel. There are 5 in this article. Robert Gifford, in this piece in New Scientist, identifies more than 30 barriers, mostly psychological. And the first one there, number 1, is our ancient brains, kind of evolutionary argument. So in a paper a couple of years ago, Jennifer Jackett, who's at NYU, and I worked together to hunt around for as many of these psychological barriers as we could find in the literature, combining those that we felt were essentially the same. And we came up with a list of about 25, I think 26 proposed psychological barriers. And there's a lot. Also, they're incredibly diverse. It seems to cover every aspect of our psychology, from things like I've mentioned, self-interest over the common good, say, but also things like favoring tokenistic change, unwillingness to relinquish sunk financial cost, and really general psychological phenomena like the fundamental attribution error and prospect theory. This might already raise alarm bells. How can everything about our minds be causing this problem? I'm not going to be able to review all of these today, but I did just want to select a few to look at in more detail. So I'm going to focus on these 3 putative psychological barriers. These aren't a random selection. I chose them because they are among the most widely cited examples of barriers to tackling climate change. And so I'll explain each one and how they're relevant to tackling climate change. Perhaps the most common claim is that we don't notice slow, insensible changes, changes that we can't see or feel. This is a picture of what high CO2 concentrations look like. That is nothing. They're invisible. We can't see them. We can't see CO2 accumulating in the atmosphere. Moreover, the effects we can observe, like rising sea levels and increased temperature or more frequent cyclones, are changing imperceptibly slowly. It's the classic frog in a pot metaphor. We can fail to escape a threat that we would have rejected if it had happened more quickly. And the argument is that our psychology's evolved to focus our attention on novel, perceptible threats, and climate change therefore just isn't salient to us. Okay, but even if changes in CO2 and its implications for our climate and livelihood are brought to our attention, there's a second problem. And that's that our brains don't prioritize events that are remote in time and space. Here's a nice quote from the Harvard psychologist Dan Gilbert. The reason why global warming doesn't trigger our concern is that we see it as a threat to our futures, not our afternoons. Economists can quantify the extent of future discounting, this is called, and they can show, for example, that people in their experiments would rather take $40 today than $100 in 10 years. That gives you a sense of the kind of magnitude of future discounting, and economists like to quantify it this way. And you can follow the curve there. So you've got months on the x-axis, subjective value. So $100 in 10 years, or what is that, about $20 in 20 years, 200 decades. So small wonder then that most of us seem to be taking a quick win, some fleeting pleasure today, over addressing environmental threats that are decades away. And the problem gets worse because we discount events that are remote in space as well as time. People from industrialized nations perceive climate change as impacting others in faraway places, we're told. And the further away people are, the less morally obligated we feel towards them. Finally, even if we do recognize that climate change is happening, and even if we're motivated to address it here and now, there's a third problem. And that's our selfish motives are not evolved to make individual sacrifices for a common good. Climate change is a commons dilemma on a global scale. That's because individuals can gain by polluting, putting out CO2, like it's convenient to drive to the local shops rather than walk, or take that cheap holiday to Samoa, but the costs of that are shared by everyone. So if everyone chooses to emit CO2, we face climate tragedy, and avoiding the tragedy means we're going to have to cooperate on a large scale. And as Van Vugt and co put it, we've evolved to prioritize personal interests over collective interests because natural selection favors individuals who can gain a personal benefit at the expense of unrelated others. We might cooperate with close kin who we are genetically related to, or friends who we have some reciprocal relationship with, but not with a world full of strangers. And so this is apparently why we've not solved climate change. So these are just three ways in which scholars and journalists argue humans are not evolved to tackle climate change. The work's well-intentioned, I think. It's motivated by the idea that by identifying these barriers, we can overcome them. For example, if slow, insensible changes are not salient to humans, then it's been suggested we should use tangible and visceral stimuli to increase awareness of environmental threats. This is an actual quote from a paper, for example, bad odors, or other suggestions have been putting additives and pollutants so we can see them. If we have difficulty prioritizing events remote in time and space, then we're told we need to prioritize, we need to present local environmental problems and create visible links between behavior and its immediate environmental consequences. And if we have a propensity for self-interest over the common good, then we're told we need to use things like kinship cues, which might kind of fool us into thinking we're genetically related to others. So that's things like referring to others as brothers or sisters. Or create programs where the environmental choice results in personal gain, so appealing to people's self-interest. So that's the argument. So we're not evolved to tackle climate change, we're told. Now in part two, I want to share some of this work I've been doing with Jennifer Jackett that challenge the idea that we're not evolved to tackle climate change, and the idea that these recommendations for overcoming our supposed evolved barriers to action are the most effective path to climate salvation. We argue not only is this view wrong, but like I said, that it's potentially a barrier itself, in fact, potentially a dangerous idea itself. Okay, so I'm going to cover three problems with essentializing climate inaction. Oversimplifying policy recommendations, framing climate change as an individual moral dilemma, and rationalizing inaction. So oversimplifying policy recommendations. Any response to climate change has to fit with our psychology. There's no denying that. But thinking about the mind as a collection of barriers tends to oversimplify the evidence in a way that can misdirect or limit our efforts. The identification of universal human psychological biases and barriers is supposed to allow us to recognize and understand our cognitive limits and thereby design strategies to overcome them. But the link between the commonly cited psychological barriers and climate action at scale is really straightforward. For example, this recommendation to use tangible and visceral stimuli to increase awareness of environmental threats seems to ignore the fact that intangible, abstract entities are some of the most powerful drivers of human behavior. People commit their whole lives to religious beliefs centered around intangible forces, for example. That shows a level of enduring commitment and shaping your life to these beliefs that I think any climate change campaigner would be glad of. Also, people do respond to unseen or abstract threats all the time. Arguably, COVID-19 is an example of this. And if you don't like that one, even opposition to COVID-19, like the 5G conspiracy theory, seems to be motivated by this strong belief in the power of abstract unseen threats. At the same time, many environmental problems we're grappling with involve pollutants that are all too visible, suggesting that the barrier to action lies elsewhere. Smog, for example, or plastic pollution are good examples. Okay. Other suggestions derived from our supposed evolved psychology sound intuitively plausible, but don't fit the evidence. For example, we're told there's this suggestion that we present local environmental problems and create visible links between behavior and its immediate environmental consequences. But the effects of proximizing the impacts of climate change are mixed. This piece by Brugger et al. Finds that the effects depend on how an individual feels about the resources in question and their power to act. And in some studies, distant appeals were more effective. They conclude rather diplomatically, I think, that the effects of proximizing are much more complex than is commonly assumed. And a more recent review, published only a month or so ago, is more forthright. They say, based on a systematic examination of the literature, we show that there is little evidence to support the prominence of psychological distance. Opinion polls show that most people actually perceive climate change as occurring now and close by. Seeing climate change as more distant does not necessarily result in less climate action, and reducing psychological distance does not reliably increase climate action. Policymakers may develop ineffective climate action campaigns because of incorrect assumptions about psychological distance. Our review highlights the importance of prioritizing evidence over intuition in policymaking to promote climate action. And sometimes the recommendations can have the opposite effect to that predicted. For example, simplistic appeals to self-interest can backfire by inhibiting intrinsic values. For example, the desire to protect our planet in favor of extrinsic values. For example, the desire to save money. Here's one nice example of that, this study by Evans et al., where they find, compared to a control condition, well, what are they doing here? They're telling people they should carpool for different reasons. And one, they say to save money, and another to save the planet. And telling people to carpool to save money can actually reduce their later motivation to do other things that help the planet, like recycling. So in the control condition, where people hadn't been given information about carpooling, they recycled at a certain rate. If you make an appeal to self-interest for carpooling, they're less likely to do this later recycling behavior. If you make a self-transcendent appeal, that is, do it for the common good, they're more likely to also do the recycling. And interestingly, the combined condition where they were asking people to carpool for self-transcendent reasons, like to save the planet, and because it's good for your wallet, actually was less effective than just appealing to the planet in terms of the knock-on effects it had on recycling rates. So that's just to say that self-interested appeals can actually have a negative effect. And maybe that's not surprising, given that we actually know that Machiavellian self-interest is a poor model of human behavior. And it's not actually predicted by evolutionary theory, although a lot of people think it is. That's kind of another talk I could give. Humans can and readily do cooperate to solve common pool resource problems, like climate change, often on a smaller scale. But Elinor Ostrom's work is a great example of this. She won the Nobel Prize in 2005, maybe 2009, anyway, a little while ago. And she identifies 8 design principles that predict successful commons management. Here's a kind of diagram of some of them. Things like clearly define the boundaries of the resources and user, devise accountability mechanisms for monitors. My point is not to go through all these now, but to say that these show we can solve large-scale commons dilemmas, and these are probably a much more promising source of guidance than to simply assume we're all selfish and appeal to self-interest. It's more complex as a set of recommendations, and maybe therefore less appealing and less widely picked up. And there's no one-size-fits-all solution, but the global commons dilemmas we face are complex problems, and so maybe it's no surprise that the path to success is also going to be complex. So I just wanted to finish this point by saying, in fact, almost any aspect of human psychology can be conceived as either a barrier or a bridge to tackling climate change. Uncertainty about the future can make room for complacency or denial and reduce motivation, but it can also promote a conservative approach to avoid risk and loss. Social conformity is another one of the barriers that was stated, and the desire for status can work against climate action, but they can also work in favor of action, depending on what the existing norms and status markers are. And optimism bias can make us foolishly hopeful and complacent. But hope can equally motivate action in the face of all odds. And religion, another barrier that's been suggested, and the promise of salvation can be a distraction or a call to arms. Or it could be a call to arms, as in Pope Francis's encyclical on climate change from a few years ago now. So all this is to say that the actual psychological evidence for features of the human mind that can be sensibly thought of as barriers to climate action is actually pretty shaky, but it gets worse. So here's the second problem, and it's that a focus on overcoming psychological biases and barriers frames climate change as primarily an individual moral dilemma, and that shifts culpability as well as research onto individuals and away from powerful corporations, from governments, and the cultural norms and institutions that shape so much of our behavior. It also shifts focus to individual consumers rather than producers of fossil fuels. Oil companies, for example, love appeals to individual responsibility. They even promote it because they recognize it shifts focus and blame away from them and onto us. It was an oil company, for example, that came up with the idea of the carbon footprint. And this also shifts focus to small nudges rather than systemic changes that are required. There's been a lot of interest over the last decade in the potential to nudge individuals one way or another. I do some of this work myself, and I think there's definitely a place for it. But the change that can be achieved in this way is often quite small. For example, a recent review of the effects of nudge behavior change programs related to home energy use found just 1 to 3% savings on average. Now, at scale, this amounts to millions of tons of CO2 saved for very low cost. So we should absolutely be nudging people in the right direction when we can. But this falls far short of the kind of transformative level of change required to actually solve climate change. Okay, the third and final of the 3 problems I wanted to note is the idea that we're not designed to solve climate change risks rationalizing our inaction. There's a long history of appeals to human nature or similar biological arguments to justify the status quo and deny the potential for social change. Socially sanctioned slavery, racism, sexism, and discrimination for sexual orientation all used appeals to biological innateness as justification. But it also risks creating a false perception that a failure to act is somehow inevitable. And that can lead to a really dangerous fatalism that I think is already being picked up by influential media figures. Catherine Ingram's long-form essay, Facing Extinction, published in 2019, is one example. Michael Franzen's piece in The New Yorker, What If We Stop Pretending, from 2019 also, present a deeply pessimistic reading of human psychology and our capacity to act. When reviewing humanity's progress to date, Franzen tells us that psychologically this denial makes sense and goes on to apply the constraints of human psychology to generate this really dystopian prediction for our future. And Catherine Ingram states that being concerned about climate change does not come naturally to us, before summarizing psychologist Dan Gilbert's article that I quoted from earlier. So these influential pieces illustrate how the notion that we're not designed to solve climate change can be and is already being used to justify climate change fatalism. Even when it doesn't create outright fatalism, the idea that we aren't evolved to tackle climate change could risk normalizing apathy towards it. Reading those newspaper headlines and claims about psychological barriers I mentioned a minute ago, you'd be forgiven for thinking that we live in a world in which nobody's paying any attention to climate change. But that's not the world we live in. Most people do care a lot about climate change. A survey across 19 countries found that on average, 75% of people think climate change is a major threat. And that was the highest score of any of the threats measured. Moreover, that number is rising, and it's even rising over the last couple of years in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Interestingly, only about 61% of people saw infectious disease as a major threat. This was right in the middle of the pandemic. So despite what we've been through the last couple of years, people are more concerned even about climate change. And this includes support for action. 80% of people surveyed said they'd be willing to make changes to how they live and work to address climate change. And more than half of people say they support a global carbon tax. This is globally. These survey results show that it's just not true that people don't attend to or care about climate change. And another example I would highlight is declarations of climate emergencies by governments, councils, and universities, and global movements like the School Strike for Climate, which interestingly is led by younger members of society. And it undermines the claim that climate action is just not in our nature. Okay, so what? What do I want you to take away from this? Well, here's some key points. First, I don't know if you've heard this idea before, but please, if you have, stop passing on the idea that we're not wired to tackle climate change. I think it's wrong and dangerous. Second, we have to be wary of simplistic claims about how to motivate climate action and be humble about the generalizability of our own work on this problem. This isn't a situation that's unique to climate change. I thought you guys might be interested in the connections with work on responding to the COVID pandemic. Psychologists have made recommendations about how leaders and communicators should respond to the COVID-19 pandemic. This paper in Nature Human Behavior is probably one of the most rapidly cited papers in psychology ever, more than 4,000 citations in just a couple of years. And I've put some of the recommendations there on the right. I won't go through them. I think there really is useful information here, especially for those who needed to quickly roll out large-scale public health campaigns. But it's also vulnerable to some of the same criticisms I've just been reviewing with respect to the psychology of climate change. In fact, Hans Eichmann, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, and colleagues make this point in a commentary published following this in Nature Human Behavior, where they suggest that what's needed is something like NASA's technological readiness levels, which is literally used to work towards moonshot projects. So what level is the technology at in the development process, and at what point can it actually be used to, say, put in a rocket or something? And this could be used to assess the readiness of social and behavioral science. And they've suggested a kind of social and behavioral science equivalent to NASA's technological readiness scale. Their suggestion is that much of the psychological evidence appealed to during the pandemic was at the mid-level, with considerable uncertainties of whether or how it would generalize to the proposed real-world applications that were being advocated. I think the psychology of climate change is probably even less well understood, which is not to say that there's not value there, but we need to kind of take it with a grain of salt and be humble, as I say, about claims made on the basis of this evidence. Okay, a final point is just that the real barriers to tackling climate change are not in human nature, or I think not productively viewed as in human nature. They are cultural constructions. And we must not mistake them for biological inevitability. So what do I mean by that? What are some examples? Well, we created corporations. I don't mean just we founded corporations, but we created we, like Western modern democracies, created the concept of a corporation that can destroy our environment, lobby to dilute meaningful environmental legislation, and then still declare a massive profit at the end of it. The influence of these organizations isn't part of the natural order. We wrote the rules that allow corporations to exist and that determine their form and behavior, and we can change those rules. Likewise, we created democratic institutions that have empowered millions, but we also allowed loopholes that give wealthy elites and companies undue influence. We can close the loopholes. More recently, we've engineered the media and now social media to propagate misinformation and create echo chambers that prevent productive debate. We can re-engineer our information landscape. And some of our most destructive habits, like eating lots of meat and flying, for example, are no more a part of our DNA than are cigarettes and steam engines. So of course, there's a sense in which we've not evolved to tackle climate change, just as we didn't evolve to sit at our desks all day, live in cities, scuba dive, promote gender equality, or read books. All these things are cultural innovations, the product of our changing technology, norms, and institutions. At the same time, then, we're not evolved to deal with climate change. The same processes of cultural change that have generated this problem make us uniquely capable of solving it. So I'd just like to finish by saying that it's time to challenge the idea that we're not wired to solve climate change, and instead make sure we're targeting the cultural shifts that will ensure that we do solve this problem. Thanks.
Thank you, Quentin. That's one simple question to start off with. Would it be possible to get a copy of the slides sent through? Would that be okay, just to kind of get those number of those links? Or
yeah, I can send that around somehow.
That'd be fine. Yeah, that would be fantastic, because there's a lot of kind of additional information that you've got on them as well, which is that's really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So look, hello to Penny and Grant, and we'll have the floor basically open to questions. There's a lot to take in there. I think it was a fairly pretty comprehensive and timely sort of, I suppose, destruction of the arguments that you know, climate change and things like that is inevitable. And I'm pleased you mentioned the Jonathan Franzen article, because I remember reading that when it came out. It was pretty well publicized, and yeah, I found it pretty empty actually in terms of the arguments that were made, and it's very easy to be to take the position of as a sort of that kind of apocalyptic position, because if you're right, you can say I told you so and everyone's dead, and if you're wrong, you can say, well, isn't it great that I'm wrong, you know? And
yeah,
I was just saying it to get people kind of rocked up and make a change. But I felt, yeah, the arguments in it were pretty weak, both from a kind of I think the climate science perspective and the human psychology perspective. Penny, you've got your hand up first, so I will give you the floor. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Thank you so much, Quentin. And I apologize, I was late. I'm so sad that I missed the start of the first 2/3 of your presentation.
Great.
I have 2 small children and my husband's not here, so I had to try to put them to bed.
I know what it's like.
But I'm really looking forward to, I'm keen to have a look at the recording. So forgive me if my questions, you covered some of this in the questions that I have in the start of the presentation. I'm really interested about, and sorry, you might have covered this, but obviously there's, it's really interesting to hear about what, the things that the human nature elements that are considered barriers can also be considered bridges. But I guess I'd be interested building on that. If we're communicating as climate and health advocates, if we're trying to communicate to the wider public or even just to the health community, what key messages or framing of those messages? So the message being obviously everybody should care about climate change, and we should not only say that we care about it, but we should act in ways that will that align with that. So, voting in the right ways and supporting the right kind of movement, the climate change movement and so on. Do you have any suggestions? I mean, this might be oversimplifying it or asking you an impossible question, but do you have any suggestions on how we might frame the way we communicate with the public and the health community? I mean, that might be the same way between those 2 different groups. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I am very conscious that this talk is kind of a critique of an attempt to offer a whole lot of suggestions, like that, we need to overcome these particular barriers, which I think are the wrong barriers to be focusing on. And then this obviously leads to, okay, well, what's your suggestion, Quentin? Like, what should we be saying? So one of the things that I was trying to emphasize is that, first of all, let's just always remind ourselves, like I'm guilty of this as a psychologist, because we always have this individual focus where we study minds, which is mostly individuals, so, that this is a problem that will require institutional change, policy change, systemic change. And so there's a sense in which we shouldn't, let this, but I want to do something on individuals' behavior. We shouldn't let that distract from the need for this policy change, say, or institutional change. But what are some specifics? I feel like what I need to do is write the follow-up paper, which is like, okay, how should we be communicating this stuff? But I do think it's often complicated. So there are what do I think? I think that so one thing is, there seems to be an assumption in a lot of this we're not evolved arguments, that we sort of have to appeal to our baser nature, that, appeal to self-interest and short-termism and all these kind of things. The evidence I'm seeing is that that's not necessarily true. And so I would say, don't be afraid to appeal to the better angels of our nature, like that, do this for future generations, do this for 100 years from now, do this. I think that's still really powerful stuff. And I think there's I guess this is what I was getting at when I said these ideas are potentially themselves barriers or dangerous. I think there's a danger that these kind of ideas will make us afraid to appeal to those things. So I would not be afraid to appeal to those things. I'm really hesitant now to try and, off the top of my head, come up with some like one-liner rules you can apply, because almost certainly we need to like have a theory about what might work, and then test it and test 5 different versions of it, and gradually converge on something that might be more effective. So yeah,
it's an impossible question.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, well, that's the other thing. There's such a tricky area, because like basically everything everyone's done so far hasn't worked. So like it's hard to come up with the silver bullet. One thing I do work on is political values and ideology, and what people across the political spectrum care about. And there's different, basically one of the things we find is there's different levels of concern about inequality and fairness across the political spectrum versus kind of people who are more comfortable with competition. Those who are concerned about inequality and fairness are much happier with solving collective action problems like this at a global level, because they tend to be equalizers. Like everyone has to work together and share, basically, including share the costs. So that's one dimension of political ideology, what a kind of inequality versus inequality and competition versus more equality and cooperation. And then another dimension is how happy you are with conformity, or how important you think it is to conform. And there's 2 kind of orthogonal dimensions. And so I'm interested in thinking about what kinds of arguments appeal across that spectrum. Interestingly, the conformists, who are among those who are kind of on the authoritarian political right, are more concerned about threats to the group than the more individualist folks on the political left. So here's one idea that you'd want to test a lot, but for those on the political left, tends to be a higher, being more comfortable with large-scale cooperative solutions to problems. So you can appeal to that and say, we need to work together to do this for the future of the planet, blah, blah, blah. There will be a group on the political right who are this conformist, more authoritarian type, who are very concerned about the group, and the arguments that will work better are to do with New Zealand security and protecting the group, for example. So that's one example, and even there, I've come up with 2 groups, and maybe we need to talk to them differently, but which is one element of the greater complication than what these simplistic barrier arguments say. But it's probably more complicated than that, right? Like there's not just 2 types of people out there. Anyway, that was a very long-winded answer to say I'm not quite sure.
Thank you. But I think that's actually, I mean, yeah, and I completely appreciate as someone who's done a lot of research in this area, it's probably quite frustrating when someone comes and says, "Can you just so what is the answer?" But
we have to ask that question. But sorry, I can't answer it today.
That's okay, but I think definitely for us it's useful to hear that, even the thought of different groups, because I think we're often, I don't know, at least me, I often feel like, well, for one, we always risk talking within our own echo chamber, I guess, and I think perhaps we don't think enough about the other group and how we might talk to them. I don't know what other people feel on that, but anyway, I will let someone else ask a question. Thank you so much.
Summer, thank you, Penny. Summer?
Yeah, kia ora, Quentin. Thank you very much, firstly, for coming along and sharing your thoughts. I really look forward to reading your paper that I think you based this talk on. Yeah, one thing I appreciated was that you kind of talked about how notions of what we define as humanity aren't necessarily correct, because I often see that people define we and us are this and that, but it tends to be very much from a very narrow view or quite Eurocentric and nihilistic view. So it was good to hear that. But my question is that climate change is often called like a wicked problem because it has so many vested interests in every sector, across all types of business and activities. And so I wonder, are we evolved to overcome those all-powerful vested interests? I know you said that corporations are a construct and they haven't existed that long, and so they're not forever, but is there anything we can learn from psychology and how to fight those interests and grow power elsewhere that can come up against those, or in another way?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Yes, I think there is, but again, it's complicated. And so I think psychology is not going to be able to issue rules of thumb for how to overcome vested interests. I mean, it's this, psychologists love to publish papers where there's like a linear relationship between variables and a graph, and you say, so this is the relationship, therefore do X, and that's the end of the story. Ben Goldacre has a book called, I think it's something like, it's a bit more complicated than that, and the paperback cover is just this like scribbly mess. Like I feel like there's something about that genuinely describes the vested interests, right? Like there's this tangled mess of conflicting interests that we somehow have to unravel. So that seems challenging, but it's clearly a problem that gets solved repeatedly. Like, I mentioned slavery, women's suffrage, civil rights. All those movements were pushing against vested interests as well, and managed to overcome. And so I think, this is not a new insight, but we can learn a lot from them. I think it's just, I mentioned before that I think we should appeal to our better angels. In terms of like the civil rights movement, I sometimes reflect on the fact that a key moment was Martin Luther King's speech at the Lincoln Memorial. It's amazing I Have a Dream speech that I think really did, if anyone could say anything to change the course of history, that's got to be right up there. But I think it's interesting that I feel like, could I, as a psychologist, have offered Martin Luther King any advice on what to say or how to improve that? I honestly don't think I could. Like, there's a kind of art to getting us through these vested interests and all the complexities and the intertwined stories that I just honestly don't think psychology is yet ready for it. Maybe this relates to that NASA technological readiness thing. We just can't fly those rockets right now. There's no way. And so I guess that's about being humble, that we need those visionaries, and there's not much of an answer, I'm sorry, but that's kind of where I'm at the moment.
Awesome, thank you.
Just on the kind of Euro or Western centric association with we, I was conscious that as I was talking just now, I did use we a lot, and it wasn't clear what I was talking to. And we actually mentioned that in the paper that relates to this work I was talking about. And note that a lot of this work on climate change is done on Western people, particularly in the US, and they're freakish in terms of their psychology for many reasons. And in terms of climate change in the US, it's like not a particularly good indicator of how most of the planet feels about this issue, not least because now it's become so kind of politicized in this weirdly tribal way that I don't is not that related to anything material about climate change as a problem. It's just now partly, I think a lot of the political feeling on it in the States is just that it's become this marker, this kind of symbol of political identity. So I just, wanted to acknowledge that, that's a really good point about who we are talking about when we say we, and that certainly there's something to bear in mind with the psychology evidence, that a lot of it is not only not representative of human diversity, but is representative of a particular group that is quite strange.
Thank you. No, it's American. I'll pass over to you, Nathan. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Yeah, thanks very much for your talk, Quentin. I took the liberty of firing a question at Quentin via email yesterday, I think it was, about I've been looking at Nate Hagen's work, and he wrote a book called Reality Blind, where he lists out a load of cognitive biases and pretty much comes to the conclusion that, there's a lot of them working against strong collective action, effective collective action. And I think that is kind of my reading of systems science, and the idea of complex adaptive systems and emergent behaviors, and the scale and the complexity of this challenge around climate change also sort of takes me in that direction of saying that this is kind of perhaps unmanageable because it's unanalyzable, and we can, and that's not to say that we shouldn't do things like appeal to people's better nature and so on, but I guess the question is specifically when it comes to that sort of systems science perspective, which I know you sort of name checked at one point during your presentation there, Quentin. How much of your thinking has tried to integrate that systems perspective? And there's this sort of trite observation as well that we haven't really evolved much in the last 300 years, and we certainly we don't seem to be heading in a particularly different direction to any of the, say, 25 or so civilizations that have risen to occupy some sort of ecological niche, hit some sort of immutable boundary, and then had some form of collapse as a result over the last 5,000 years or so, if that makes sense.
So I'm coming at this from the perspective of someone who's a psychologist, a research psychologist, and interested in human behavior and the role that evolution plays. And I guess I'm critical of a lot of the claims made in that area. And as I tried to articulate, I think that actually a lot of the barriers are cultural or systemic, and we should absolutely be paying attention to that. It's not my area, so that system science stuff is not something I can speak about with great authority. I definitely think we should be looking at that. These are genuinely complex systems, though, so one of the challenges for system science is to do science on complex systems, because it's really hard, especially when the current geopolitical and economic system, there's only really one pace to study, so it's really hard to generalize and extract general laws versus historical contingency from it. But I would say, just on the kind of the pessimism about collapse, which is definitely, I read Jared Diamond's book Collapse and thought it was brilliant, and it's definitely affected my thinking about our future. On the other hand, you could tell a different story about the trajectory of human culture and civilization over the last 10,000 years. You could say that 10,000 years ago, we were only really able to cooperate in groups of a few hundred individuals, tribes, or maybe groups of tribes gathering together, maybe a bit more than 10,000 years, say 15,000 years ago. And then since then, with the changes in technology, agricultural production, the drivers, it's another lecture to give, but you know, social complexity, the scale of human cooperation has gradually been increasing, and it's not clear to me that we're at the end point there, that, you know, that we can't increase that scale of complexity and cooperation more. I sometimes think to myself, you know, imagine if we were having this conversation in ancient Athens with Sparta down the road, wondering, you know, is it ever really going to be possible to cooperate beyond the city-state? It's not we evolved to live in small groups, and there's no real way. It's just beyond human capacity to cooperate at a larger level than the city-state. And they would have looked around and, you know, no other civilization can do this. It's just not possible. And yet since then, the trajectory has continued, and those civilizations like Athens and Sparta now look quite small and simple to us. And so I guess it's an open question, I think, whether we can scale things up. And key to that process has been changes in resources, but also technologies. And it's clearly the case, even the last decade, that there are different social technologies being created that could be a game changer in terms of how we can coordinate and cooperate.
Okay, thank you for your answer. It's food for thought for sure. Thank you.
I'm just conscious of the time. Penny, I'll give you this question. There's one question from Grant in the chat as well, which I will just read out. Quentin, you mentioned Eleanor Ostrom's work. I only came across her studies of resources held in common a couple of years ago, but found them very compelling. Could you expand on their relevance to climate action?
So I've been suggesting that one of the things that we should focus our attention on is how is the systems that we live within. And Ostrom's work, she studied smaller scale examples of cooperation where people got together to manage common resources. Like a lot of her work looked at like a shared water table in California, or forest resources, or fisheries resources. And she there's an interesting story to tell about her work. She's kind of initially struggled to draw any conclusions from it. It wasn't making sense, but at some point she kind of stepped back and tried to identify higher level patterns in the data she had, and came up with these 8 design principles that where groups of people conform to most or all of these principles, they seem to be able to much more effectively work together to manage a common resource. So since then, there's been a lot of interest in this work and whether and how it could be scaled up from some of the smaller scale systems she was studying to much larger scale or even global commons. But one of the promising aspects of her work is one of the design principles is this kind of hierarchical nature where you have groups within groups controlling or responsible for resources. Like there might be some spatially patterned thing where people have different levels of responsibility for different parts of a forest, and then there's some overarching structure above that and an overarching structure above that, and that seems to work well for managing commons. And of course, if that's the case, then you should in theory be able to keep scaling things up, or at least we should be interested in whether we can. So that's, yeah, I mean, there's a lot to say about her work. She has a book, Governing the Commons, which is worth a read and goes through the design principles. I thoroughly recommend it.
Thank you. Penny, do you want to put your question?
I was just going to comment on the system science question, just very quickly. So I don't know if you've read, I'm sure you probably have Nathan, but Donella Meadows, and she has I think there's 12 different leverage points within the system within a different hierarchy. So the highest within a complex system. And I guess I'm not sure which specific complex system you're talking about, whether you're talking about the natural system and how climate change affects the natural system, or whether you're talking about more the social system, political systems, which are obviously socially.
I guess I'm kind of talking about the interplay between all of them and the emergent complexities that arise from that. Yeah.
So I guess, I mean, I guess as just a small point of optimism, I guess the highest within what, you know, Meadows says that the highest leverage point within a system is the paradigm, and the paradigm then within the paradigm there are rules, and then there are obviously system structures and, you know, feedback processes and so on and so forth down 12 different points in place you can intervene in the system. And I guess the paradigm is often socially constructive. Obviously within a biological system that's not socially constructed, but climate change is so socially driven, I suppose. And so I guess there's a point of optimism there that, you know, we make the paradigm, we can change the paradigm, and we can shift by changing the paradigm, we change the system rule of the systems, and therefore we can completely restructure the system in the way that it's driving us towards the edge, I guess. Anyway,
thank you for that reminder. It is a good reminder, and it's a reminder of why I feel that the degrowth conversation is a really important one, because that is really challenging that growth mentality, which is a very significant, you know, paradigm.
And there had been such a vacuum, hadn't there, until the last couple of years around we've got neoliberalism, what's the alternative? And we, you know, we've critiqued neoliberalism for so long, and now it's only just in the last couple of years, and even more recently than that the degrowth kind of paradigm has stepped in and taken up that kind of vacuum a little bit. Anyway, I'll stop.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I will. Julie or Tim, do you want to make any comments, quick comments before we finish? Or?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. This is not my area at all, so it's really interesting to hear this. But the questions I had, or the question I might have had, was kind of covered, which was essentially over whether climate arguments, and acknowledging what we've heard about the fact that it's not primarily about individual psychology, whether climate arguments need to be framed differently for people with different value systems, particularly thinking of the things that appeal to people on the left, arguments that appeal to people on the left versus the right. But I feel Quentin did cover that in the earlier comments, so thank you for that.
Can I just jump in there very quickly and say I was really reminded in Quentin's comments around that of the Common Cause Handbook and that diagram of intrinsic versus extrinsic values and the way they're all sort of mapped to each other. And I thought that was it seemed like your work kind of corroborates that diagram and the way that those values sort of are mapped out in that handbook.
I don't know the handbook, but it sounds interesting. Yeah, maybe you could.
I'll send you a copy for sure. Yeah.
I don't have any comments or questions, but thank you very much for the interesting talk and the discussion afterwards. It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I would also very much like to thank you, Quentin. The questions were brutal tonight. I'm sorry, they were really hard, but you handled them with aplomb. So that is really good. And I would class myself in the same group as Tim, as someone who's very much not an expert on this at all. And it's good to get the kind of that kind of sweep of history. I like that, where we look at, you know, the complexity of sort of human society since, you know, the Stone Age and before that even, and how that has changed. And even I was struck as well over the last couple of 100 years, even the changes that have happened in every country, in every society around the world, agricultural, industrial revolutions, colonialism, and the impacts of that. And you know, we humans have created those changes, and I personally don't think there's any reason why we can't take another step and actually solve some of the problems that have arisen as a result of those. Really good. So thank you, and we'll have this up on YouTube presently in the next few days. I will close with a karakia, and I am off then to another Zoom on minority languages in medical education, which is being hosted in Cardiff, I think. So it'll be interesting to listen in on that. Thank you all for coming. Unuhia, 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 ki te uru tapanui, kia wātia, kia mama, te ngākau, te tinana, te wairua I te ara takata, koia rā e rongo, whakaira ake ke runga, kia tina, tina, huie,
Taikie.
And thank you all for coming, and a huge thank you, Quentin. Really interesting.
Yeah, no, thanks. I enjoyed the discussion. Cheers.
Thanks, Quentin.
Bye.
Pomari.
Pomare.